Hey everyone, it's Alice here, and I'm just filming my November wrap-up today. It was a pretty good reading month, considering we weren't expecting to read as many books as we read in October and September. Quite proud to say that we actually read 18 books in November. So let me show you some of the ones that we read. I started the month with a bit of a non-fiction kick, so I read Period by Emma Barnett, You're Crushing It by Lex Croucher, and Talking to My Daughter About the Economy by Yanis Varoufakis. So very, very different books. Period is all about periods. It's about how different people experience them, the way that society looks at them, and it's a very feminist book, obviously. But it's also quite empowering, because to go through your whole life feeling like periods are a bad thing and they're really disgusting, to hear somebody just like owning it and telling you like embarrassing period stories and being really honest about their experience, it does really put you in touch with your own body. So I really recommend that one. I gave that one 4 stars. You're Crushing It was a bit less of a success. It's meant to be kind of like an empowering, inspirational book, but it fell a bit flat. There's lots of generic advice in there. There's some like pretty quote pages, which didn't really translate well for me because I was reading it as an ebook, so I might have liked it more if I was reading a physical copy, but it was just quite generic. I can see what Lex Croucher was trying to do with it, but I've read better books in the past that do the similar thing. So if you haven't read many non-fiction books that are kind of about empowerment and mindfulness and getting into a better headspace, I'd recommend it in that case. But if you've already read a few, then it's one that you can skip. I actually gave that one 2 stars. And Talking to My Daughter About the Economy, we ended up giving this one 4 stars. I read this with my partner and our daughter, but she is very small, so she has no idea what any of these words mean. But we decided we're going to keep hold of it and read it with her in the future, because it does give you a really simple, basic description of how the economy works and how capitalism works, all the different things about kind of finance. And I don't really have a head for money or a head for that kind of thing. So it was interesting to read a book that put it in a way that was not only accessible, but it was also very understandable. And Yanis Varoufakis does an amazing job of putting everything in very basic terms. And because he's writing this as though it's written to his daughter, it's very simple and he explains everything very well. We ended up giving this 4 stars. The next book that we read in November was The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This is the entire reason that we didn't do a November TBR, because we knew that we were going to try and read The Priory of the Orange Tree, and it is so chunky that we weren't sure how long it was going to take us. So the story is quite difficult to describe in a basic way. There's a girl called Ede who is from the Priory of the Orange Tree, and she gets implanted into the palace so that she can look after the queen, because the belief is that the queen is the only reason that this big scary dragon isn't reviving, isn't returning. Not sure what the right word is. So Sabran is the entire reason that this big bad is not coming and destroying the entire world. So Ede is implanted in the palace to protect her, but it soon becomes apparent that it might actually not be Sabran that is causing the dragon to stay where it is. There's actually a lot of different factors going on all at once. It follows multiple characters. It's not just Ede that it follows. So you jump from the east to the west and you go down to the south. You follow a lot of different places. It can be a bit slow at points. I definitely enjoyed the last half more than the first half, because there's a lot of establishing. There's a lot of exposition about the world, a lot of kind of jumping between the characters and really getting to grips with them before they can really go on their adventures. But I thought the differences between the 2 kinds of dragons that Samantha Shannon puts in here were amazing. There's like water dragons and fire dragons. They have special names, but there's no recollection in my mind because my mind is a sieve. But honestly, I gave it 4 stars. Would have been a bit higher, but I think just the amount of exposition at the beginning is quite dense, and as someone who doesn't read a lot of fantasy, it did put me off a little bit. That being said, by the end of the book, I was absolutely blown away by it. I thought it was very accessible by the end, and especially because I really grew attached to the characters. I found myself rooting for basically everybody. Even the characters whose morals are a bit less clear-cut, they still have redeemable factors, and I think Samantha Shannon makes all of her characters so realistic. Like, they all have good and bad aspects, they all have their own hopes and desires, and they also all fit together so nicely. Like, the interactions between the characters are written so well. I kind of wish that it was more than one book, because I do think having it all in one book made it a bit limiting. If she'd split it, it might have been easier for her to explore some more of the backstory that she's made, because there's a lot of like old folklore tales and myths and legends laced through it, told from one character to another, and I'm really interested to learn more about this world. She has said she's interested in revisiting it in the future, and I really hope she does, because there's so much more potential with this world. But as it stands, Priory is a 4-star for me. While we were reading Priory, we decided to splice it through with some light-hearted reads, so we read The Ladybird Book of Boxing Day, The Ladybird Book of the Nerd, and The Ladybird Book of the Zombie Apocalypse. They're all just really short, kind of quirky, funny stories. If you ever read Ladybird books as a child, they're very similar. So you get like a funny picture and then a little funny caption that relates to the picture. Obviously, the Nerd, the Boxing Day, and the Zombie Apocalypse being the 3 subjects that are focused on. We ended up giving the Nerd 3 stars, but the other 2 got 5 stars because they really, really cracked us up. Just really, I think we picked these up at the perfect time, because where Priory is quite dense, it can be quite emotionally draining at points, so it was nice to just have something else that we could kind of dip in and out of, just kind of have some fun with. Definitely good ideas for Christmas, so if you're struggling to think of presents for anybody, or you've got family members who like reading but don't like reading too much, these are really cute little ideas. The next book that we read in November was Rules for Vanishing by Kate Alice Marshall. Now this is the story of a girl whose sister disappears. She's always been obsessed with the story of Lucy Gallows, who is a girl who went out into the forest, found a magical wood that appeared, a magical path that appeared in the woods, went down this path and was never seen again. Now, our main character's sister was obsessed with this story, and she went down the same path, so our main character decides to follow in her sister Becca's footsteps and go and see whether she can find her sister. She gets a bunch of her friends involved, they all go out to this path, and then as they kind of travel down the path, more spooky goings on happen, and it's a case of, will any of them make it out alive? It's very cleverly written. It jumps between kind of witness statements, so Sarah's narrative is told as though it was witness statements that she was writing, and those interspiced with interviews between her and someone who is following the case. Mobile phone footage, messages, voicemails, things like that. So it really does incorporate a lot of different styles of writing, and it makes it a very quick read, because you jump from like an interview over here to like a little kind of transcript of a video over here. But although it's very cleverly written, like there's bits that you don't pick up on when they're happening, and then when it's brought to your attention you're like, oh, how did I not see that happened? Like when one of the characters is taken, they aren't mentioned for a few pages, but because the cast is so big, you just think it's because you've lost track of them in that respect, not because they're actually gone. So when that's brought to your attention, it is really clever. But I ended up giving it 3 stars because it has a really, really terrible ending. It was so bad that I turned the last page and was like, that can't be the last page. So I just kind of kept flicking through to the end of the book. So yeah, we gave it 3 stars, but it is being adapted into a TV show or a movie or something. It's just been announced that it's been optioned. So hopefully it will translate better to the kind of visual media, because I think being able to jump between the interview room and the kind of video footage and things, they've got a lot to play with when they're kind of casting it and staging it, and hopefully it will live up to expectations. The next two books that we read in November were Everless and the sequel, Evermore, which I have already returned to the library. So this was actually a reread for me of Everless, but it was the first time I read it with my partner, but it was the first time for both of us reading Evermore. So this actually ended up getting a star less than I gave it when I read it the first time, because there's some aspects of it that I think reading it a year later, I really didn't enjoy. So the story is that there is a world where blood has been infused with... blood has been infused with time. So when you bleed time, and that is the currency in this world. So if you are in debt to somebody, then you might owe them like 2 months or 3 years, and they can bleed it from you. They should probably find out how much time you have left first, but only like one of the bleeders actually does that, because they don't really care about humans and life and living. So basically, this girl called, I've forgotten her name because it's been like 3 days since we finished it. Why wouldn't I forget her name? Jules Ember. I got it. So this girl called Jules decides to go to the Palace of Everless to work, to get money because her papa is in a lot of debt. But when she's there, he ends up dying. So she has this warning from him just before he dies, and he tells her to keep away from the Queen because she cannot see her. Now, the Queen is going to Everless because the Queen's daughter is marrying Rowan, who is Jules' childhood sweetheart. They loved each other from the beginning, but not really, because Rowan's a massive asshole, and I didn't really get that first time around. So like this time around I was like, oh, why did I like him so much last year? But so in Everless you kind of meet Jules and you get introduced to the world, but in Evermore you follow more of like the mythology behind how the sorceress and the alchemist, who are the ones who bound blood and time and iron all together, you get more of the kind of mythology in the second book. I ended up taking my rating from Everless down from a 4 to a 3, and I ended up only giving Evermore 2 stars because it just wasn't what I was expecting at all, which is such a shame because it was my most anticipated sequel that was being released in 2019. It came out in January, but I've only just been able to get hold of a library copy, which is why I've waited so long. But I kind of wish I'd just left it as it was, because Everless is really enjoyable until it gets to the epilogue, which ruins everything. Like, honestly, if you could cut the epilogue from the end of this book, it would be a 5-star for me every time. But it's just a case that she writes a few more pages than she probably should, and she explains herself out of a perfect place to end this story. And then when you pick up the story in Evermore, everything's kind of undone. There's lots of kind of travelling all over the place, like, oh, I'm trying to evade capture, oh, I've been captured, oh, I've evaded capture again, oh, I've been captured again. And I know that appeals to some people, but when it happens 2 or 3 times within a matter of chapters, I just lose all interest. I find myself not caring about Jules, I find myself not caring about any of the characters. The most interesting characters have kind of been killed off, and the love interest that happens in the second book just didn't really seem necessary. It was very cliched, it came out of nowhere, and yeah, it's a big disappointment because this was one of my favourite books that I read last year, so it's a shame that the rest of the duology didn't impress me as much. Sarah Holland's third book is called Havenfall, and it's being released next year. I believe it might be a January release. I'm considering picking it up, but after seeing how this went downhill, I'm not too sure, because it wasn't even just the story. Like, the writing itself went downhill a lot. Like, it didn't seem very well thought out. There was a lot of repetition. There was a lot of kind of like the same word, like dizzying. It's just used over and over and over again. And I was like, oh, how many times have I said the word dizzying since we started reading this? And yeah, I don't really get on with books that are like that, which is a massive shame. The next book that I finished in November was We Are Blood and Thunder by Kezia Lupo. This one was another 2 stars for me. I've just had a bit of a bad reading month in some aspects. Like, I had some really solid reads at the beginning, some really solid reads at the end, but the middle just kind of died a death. So there's a mysterious place called Duke's Forest, and there is a storm above this forest that is caused by some kind of magic. So magic is outlawed in Duke's Forest, and if you're suspected of being a mage, you are killed. So when we start the book, we are following a girl called Elena who has just been accused of being a mage. She's been found guilty. She is being chased by dogs. She manages to escape from Duke's Forest, and in the forest she bumps into a mysterious hooded lady who goes into Duke's Forest because it's obviously really well secured, considering nobody's been allowed to like enter or leave for like a decade. So Lena goes off, trains to be a mage. The girl who comes back ends up being the Duke's daughter. She kind of inherits. Turns out she's also a mage. Lots of magic-y stuff. I think the problem with We Are Blood and Thunder for me is that I've just read too many books that are similar to it. I knew exactly what was going to happen. You could tell as soon as you met the mage lady. I've forgotten her name. Oh my god, why am I so bad at this? As soon as you met the Duke's daughter, you could tell that she was going to be kind of a bit evil, and I was like, oh yeah, she's totally the one that cast the spell that made the storm. And I was like, no, it can't be that, that's really predictable. Oh yeah, it was. It was. There's a sequel coming out next year for some godforsaken reason. There is no tension at the end of the book, it just finishes, it wraps up really nicely, there are no stories that need continuing, and yet it's getting a sequel, because why does everything need a sequel in YA? Just finish it. Just finish it and have a really solid standalone. Don't put extra books on for no unnecessary, for no godforsaken reason. Just whapping more sequels out all over the place and making it so that it's just kind of a bit of a cash cow. I've had this argument before, and I will do a video about it in the future, because at the moment I'm just having all of these series pop into my head, and I'm like, oh, I could rant about so many of these at the moment. But this is definitely one of them for me. We Are Blood and Thunder should have been a standalone. I don't think I'm going to bother picking up the second book, because if it's a 2 stars and it was the first one, how much worse can the second one be? The next book that we finished in November was Insomniac City, New York, Oliver Sacks and Me by Bill Hayes. This is a memoir that is interspersed with Bill Hayes' photography that he takes while living in New York. And it's all about his relationship with Oliver Sacks and his relationship with New York. So Billy moves to New York after his partner Stephen dies, and he just kind of throws himself into this new world. He gets on with his photography. He tries to make the most of a terrible situation by making this new life for himself. And when he meets Oliver Sacks, they fall in love, and sadly Oliver ends up dying at the end of the book, which I knew it was going to happen because I knew Oliver Sacks was dead, but also it was so heartbreaking. It's just, I didn't know much about Oliver Sacks going into this. I'd never heard of Billy Hayes. My partner thought it had a cool cover, so he grabbed it in a charity shop, I think. And then when I was like, oh, pick a book for me to read, he threw this one on my lap, and I was like, oh, okay, fine. It's got really small fonts. I thought it was going to be a really slow read. But it intersperses little journal notes that Billy has made to himself. So you get to really see his life with Oliver play out in real time. So you don't just get his kind of, this is what happened when I first moved to New York. You also get his alive feelings and thoughts as he's kind of adjusting to this new place and learning who this guy is that he's met, and becoming really good friends with him, and then eventually becoming more. I think it's just a brilliant look at grief and death and loss, and I think the way that you can move on with your life and you can be happy again even if you feel like you're never going to be. I think the way that Billy writes about it is just so inspiring and so uplifting. And if you have lost anyone and you are in that state of mind where you feel like you're never going to be happy again, I would recommend just giving Insomniac City a try, because it'll probably make you cry your eyes out and you'll probably find it really hard to breathe at points because it's really raw. But I think it could do really good things for you. So hopefully it will. And there are some really funny little anecdotes in here as well, so it should at least put a little bit of a smile on your face. We gave Insomniac City 4 stars. The next book that we read in November was another reread, and it was The Collector by John Fowles. So I studied this one in my A-levels, as you can see, because it's really bashed up. It got really water damaged in my bag one day because I was terrible at looking after books and reading when I was a teenager. And I read it over and over again. I think I read it 3 times in a week because it was just that good. And I kept going on to my partner about it and saying I really want to read The Collector to you. and we read The Collector together, and it is still 5 stars. So this is about a boy called Frederick. I wanted to say Ferdinand because he pretends his name is Ferdinand, so that wasn't me being stupid. A boy called Frederick who falls so in love with this girl called Miranda that he kidnaps her and locks her in a basement that he curates full of her tastes. So he has like artwork she likes, he buys her like a special wardrobe, he gets all the books that she wants, he does everything he can for this girl because he just loves her that much. And as you can tell, that is not a healthy thing to do, so it doesn't end well. But it's written so brilliantly because John Fowles jumps from Frederick's perspective into Miranda's perspective, like she's writing a diary while she's trapped in this basement. So you get Frederick's stories of like, oh, I really love Miranda. Oh, Miranda's being a bit of a dick today. I wonder why. Because you've kidnapped her, Frederick. That's why. But then you also get Miranda's justifications behind all of the things that she does and says and how she feels. And honestly, I cannot rate this highly enough. I think if you're looking for an accessible classic, this is ideal. And definitely will always and forever be a 5 star. I just need to read more John Fowles in the future to see if the rest of his writing is as good as this one. So the next book that I finished in November was Enchantée by Gita Trelise. I hope I'm saying that right because I've never heard it said out loud before. So I had heard really, really good things about this one on BookTube, and I'd heard that it was really magical. It's set in Paris around the time of all of the events of Marie Antoinette and Versailles and the uprising that kind of overthrew the French monarchy. But we follow a girl called Camille who is... So Camille uses something called La Magie Ordinaire, which is a little simple way of changing like scraps of metal into coins, and she uses it to provide for her family. She ends up realising that she can change card faces so that she can gamble and she can pretty much guarantee that she's going to win. So she finds herself going and gambling in Versailles and doing all of this like crazy stuff. While also falling in love with a guy who has some hot air balloons, and he like crashes his hot air balloon and she saves him. I don't really know. It's all very disjointed. So it feels like 2 separate stories. The story of the hot air balloon and the story of the magic feel completely separate, and they don't really cross over until about 3/4 of the way through. So the first half of the book, very disjointed, and the whole thing is so slow that I genuinely am surprised that it's getting rated as highly as it is. It reads more like literary fiction than YA. If I'd known it was going to be similar to that, I probably would have avoided it because literary fiction, 9 times out of 10, I mean, there's the odd exception, but 9 times out of 10 it bores me to tears. I would rather have something with an actual plot. But the problem is the whole story of Enchantée was just so boring. I think I read I was reading it on my library app, so the last like 300 library app pages, it's not actually that long. I read like the last 300 pages in a day, but the whole thing was like 1,000 pages on this library app, and I was reading like 20 a day and just falling asleep because it was just so boring. I don't know why people seem to laud it so much, and it's another book that is getting a sequel next year and there is no reason for it, like apart from the fact that like all of the like Versailles uprising is happening at the end of the book. Like I could see how they can go into that a bit more, but everything else is just so neatly closed and all the characters are so dealt with and wrapped up and everything's very neat and there's a big shiny bow over the whole thing, and then you find out it's having a sequel. Why do we keep doing this, publishers? Just buy standalones, please. So yeah, 2 stars for Enchantée, and that's being generous. That's literally just because the last 500 pages of this library app were like slightly more interesting. So the next book that we read in November was also from my library app, and it was The Boy in the Black Suit by Jason Reynolds. Now thankfully this one was a 5-star read, and I deserved to read a good book this month, so I was grateful, so grateful that I really enjoyed it. So The Boy in the Black Suit follows a boy whose mother dies, and he starts working in a funeral home, helping out with the funerals. He's a pallbearer. He like sets up the wakes, puts all like the food out and sets up the places, the seats and things. But he really enjoys going to funerals. He finds that when you can see the person who is closest to the person who has died, you can see that moment when they break. And because he had that moment at his mum's funeral, he's just like vicariously living through all these people. He's like, I'm not the only one that feels as bad as I do. You're also really depressed. And I just thought it was brilliant, because when you go to a funeral and you see that moment, you really do empathise with it. You really do feel like, oh God, that's awful. Like, I can remember feeling like that. But not many people empathise with it that strongly. They're like, I'm going to go to as many funerals of strangers as I can. And I just loved the way that it was dealt with. He ends up falling in love with a girl called Love, who is the granddaughter of one of the people whose funerals he goes to. And their relationship is just so sweet. Like, it's so wholesome. She's like, oh, do you want to come round? And he's like, yeah. And she's like, to go to the shelter and help my homeless friends. And he's like, yeah. And I just thought it's just so sweet. And Jason Reynolds, the only other book of his that I've read is Long Way Down, so I was expecting this to be in verse. So when I opened the book and it was in prose, I was like, this is not what I signed up for, and I really didn't think I was going to enjoy it, but I loved it so much more than Long Way Down, and I gave Long Way Down 5 stars as well. Like, Jason Reynolds' writing is just superb, and I think he just gets the kind of teen emotional experience so well. But he also incorporates kind of harder aspects of life. So it's not like all la-di-da. Like, he has like happy moments. His characters have these uplifting kind of relationships, and they have hope. But also it's not that simple. Like, it's very layered. They're very multi-dimensional. I just think he is brilliant. And if you haven't read any of his work yet, then that is something that you really need to do. The next book that I read in November was another one from the library app, and it was Paper Avalanche by Lisa Williamson. This is Lisa Williamson's third book. You'll probably have heard of her because she did The Art of Being Normal. I can't even remember when that came out, but that was one of my favourite books when it was released. And it was a really, really big, popular book. Paper Avalanche is completely different. So it's about a girl whose mother is a hoarder. She lives in this house and she's got paper piled up all the sides. Like, she doesn't even know what colour her carpet is because all she's ever walked on is paper. Her mum keeps coming back from shopping with like thousands of bags, and she doesn't care about the fact that they're in debt. She doesn't worry at all. She just keeps putting everything on her card. And this girl starts getting feelings for the boy next door, and she knows that she can't act on it because she can never have him round because she's embarrassed of her mother and her home, and she's like, everything's a mess. And then she makes her first best friend, and she knows she can never invite her round, and like, she enjoys going around her house, but it's not the same because she's really guarded. Like, no one knows where she lives. She pretends she lives 6 doors down from where she does because she just doesn't want anybody to know that that's her house. But when it all comes out, it's very interesting to see how the other characters react to it and how sympathetic and how understanding people can be. And I think often in YA, you find that as soon as there's like a big drama, everyone just piles on, there's no sympathy at all. And that isn't realistic. When bad things happen in real life, at least one person is not going to be a shit to you, because that's just the way that humans work. There's going to be at least one person who's going to go out of their way to be like, are you alright? I care about you. But Lisa Williamson does it in a brilliant way, that she has the sympathy characters. She has the horrible characters too, don't get me wrong. But it's a very realistic way that they all interact. Meanwhile, the kind of like subplot is that the girl, again, I've forgotten her name. Oh my god, why can I just not remember the names of any of these characters? So our protagonist is interested in singing, and she applies to be part of the National Youth Choir, and when she goes for one of her auditions, her mum comes along and makes her late. And I just think the whole scene there, when she's kind of like laying it down to her mum, like, you are selfish, you don't care about me, you don't care about my dreams, and you've just ruined everything. I think so many teenagers feel that way, but they can't express it. And I'm not telling you to like go out and yell at your parents, because that's not the best thing to do, especially when you're living under their roof. But everyone has to have a breaking point. And I think that Lisa Williamson builds it up and up and up so slowly that when the explosion happens, it's so realistic. And honestly, I was reading this in the middle of the night hoping that I would eventually drop off back to sleep. And then I just read the entire book in one go. That was a mistake because I was very tired the next day. But that just proves how captivating this writing is. You cannot put it down. And yeah, I gave it 4 stars because I thought a couple of subplots weren't handled as well as I wanted them to be. Like, the ending is very neat, but there's like bits that kind of just get dropped halfway through. I don't know whether that was intentional to kind of demonstrate the fact that she had so much going on that she had bigger priorities, bigger fish to fry. But it made me feel a bit like, oh, well, actually, like, you think the audition's gone terribly, but you never really get that closure of, like, her opening the rejection letter and being like, oh, God, everything's ruined. It's just she has a bad feeling and then it's never talked about again. Which, like, fair enough. That's one way of dealing with it, just never talking about it again. But I just think that, like, having that kind of moment when she had to really face the reality of how terribly things had gone would have been very powerful. So yeah, 4 stars for Paper Avalanche. So the penultimate book that I finished in November was Furious Thing by Jenny Downham. I actually borrowed this one from the library and was intending to keep my copy to wave at the camera, but I returned it because I'm way too efficient occasionally. So Furious Thing is the story of a girl called Lexi who gets mad. So her soon-to-be stepfather is a bit of a dick. He's really derogatory towards her mother. He blames her for everything that goes wrong. He idolises her little sister, but it's in a way that's very pushy. So her little sister genuinely talks like she's like 15 because she's like, oh, I need to be all educated and really not a child because that will impress father. It's like, if you're 6, just be 6. Like, you don't need to know words that long. So Lex is someone who gets very angry a lot of the time. She has a lot of meltdowns, she throws things, she's very aggressive, but she doesn't want to be. So it's a very clever look at the way that sometimes your emotions can bubble up and you have no other outlet than to just get them out. And even if you regret it straight away, it's too late. But it's also a very clever look at the way that sometimes your family can push you to do things like that. Because there are times when Lex isn't really feeling that mad. She's like angry because he's like, her stepfather John is talking down to her mum. But her little sister's like, do your furious thing. Like, that'll make everything better. Then he'll stop shouting at mum. And Lex is there and she has that internal conflict of like, do I make a scene just to stop him from shouting at mum, or do I let them get on with it? And I think that is a pressure that should never be put on anybody. That is so unfair. But it's also very realistic, because if you see your parents arguing, you are going to want to stop it and you are going to want to interfere. And sometimes you're not going to be able to do that in a proactive, kind of positive way. There's also kind of a subplot in that she's in love with her stepfather's son, which is written so cleverly. Like, so he has always kind of flirted with her and she's always thought they're going to end up together. But when she eventually kind of pursues him, he keeps pursuing her back but then knocking her back at the same time. So he'll say something really flirty, but it'll be really barbed and like it'll be quite backstabby in the same respect. And she doesn't really know what's going on and she can't really figure out why he's like it. And I think that again, like, I would have read a book just based off of their relationship, because I thought the dynamics there was so fascinating and they really reminded me of someone that I had feelings for when I was younger, and the way that they would be exactly the same, like really, really flirty and then like, oh no, no. And so if you've experienced anything like that, this book will also really appeal to you. I ended up giving this book 5 stars. It's the 4th book that Jenny Downham has released, and it's the 4th book of hers that I've read, but it's by far my favourite already. She's just superb at writing about teens and teen emotions, and she really hits the nail on the head every time. And I think her writing is just so authentic. It just really rolls off the tongue, and you just find yourself flying through like 100 pages in like 25 minutes or something ridiculous like that, because it just feels so natural, the way that it progresses and the way that all the characters talk and the way that she writes it, that you can't help yourself just doing, one more chapter. So if you haven't read any Jenny Downham yet, but you like really fast, hard-hitting contemporary reads, she is exactly the author for you. So the last book that I read in November was actually one that I decided to read on a whim on the 30th of November, and it was Solitaire by Alice Oseman. Didn't think I was going to read it in a day. Ended up reading it in a day. So this is Alice Oseman's debut novel. So I read Radio Silence, which was her 2nd book. Absolutely loved it. Read I Was Born for This, which was her 3rd book. Wasn't as impressed. Solitaire falls directly between the two of them for me. This is a 4-star book. So there's a girl who starts at sixth form, and she's walking down the corridor, and there are pink post-it notes with arrows on them. She's like, oh, I'll follow those post-it notes. And she goes into this classroom, and there's a link to a website called solitaire.co.uk. And she's like, okay, what? But then there's this boy called Michael there, and he's like, oh, you're also following the post-it notes. She's like, yeah, who are you? Because he's new to the school. And so not only does this follow the story of Solitaire, who is the mastermind behind it, what they end up doing, and it also follows the relationship between Tori and Michael and how it develops, because Tori is someone who hates everybody, which I really related to. There are so many quotes in the first half of this book that I like popped up on my Goodreads and was like, yeah, I really relate to this. And I think if I'd read this when I was in sixth form, it would have been one of my favourite books of all time. I'm just slightly too old for it now. I found the ending was quite far-fetched and it didn't really seem realistic at all. Alice Oseman was very young when she wrote it, so I can kind of see why that might be part of the problem, that she kind of had a big idea in her head but didn't quite know how to pull it off. So the emotion throughout this book is just really strong. Like, Tori kind of wants to change because she wants to fit in more, but also she's just kind of happy being herself. She's like, there's this quote when she's like, oh, I blog and I sleep. I'm going to die one day. Like, yeah, pretty much it. Like, that's okay. You don't have to be, like, outgoing. You don't have to have all of the friends and be, like, part of the party crew. But it's really interesting to see her opinion on things change throughout the book. Again, if you haven't read Alice Oseman, another amazing contemporary writer, just UKYA. Pick up some UKYA contemporaries and you will not be disappointed. Okay, so that is it for this November wrap-up. So yeah, 18 books in total, which I'm pretty proud of. I know that 3 of them were really, really short, so it should technically just be 15. But I'm allowed to cut corners somewhere, surely. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've read any of these books and have any feelings to share, please just pop them down in the comments and I'll get back to you. Subscribe if you want, like it if you liked it, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye!